Hi, welcome back. You're still watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Welcome to it if you've just joined us on this African month as we delve into the issues about Africa, around Africa, and of course other top stories around the globe. We continue with an international conference underway for the first time in Africa, and that is the Global ILO Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor. So for the first time in 20 years, the number of children being put to work has risen to around 160 million worldwide, representing an increase of 8.4 million over 4 years. We mentioned that earlier. That was one of the main takeaways from the most recent report on child labor produced by UNICEF and the International Labour Organization, pointing to some 63 million girls and 97 million boys who were in child labor globally at the beginning of 2020. The report also shows that in sub-Saharan Africa, population growth, extreme poverty and inadequate social protection measures have led to more than 16 million children in child labor over the past 4 years. Our reporter Liabo Setho, who's at the conference, spoke to Cosatu head of policy Lebogang Mulaisi about policies that should and are preventing child labor in South Africa.
We've been exploring different angles with regards to the elimination of child labor, from where it's more prevalent, what can be done, which industries are more susceptible to child labor. But the most important tool that is obviously important is policy. Policy guides everything, because as a business or as a household, you will know that if a child is, for instance, under the age of 15 in South Africa and they are doing certain amount of work or a certain type of work, then that constitutes child labor. But policy is there to guide you. What policy do we have in South Africa and how is it applied? What can be improved upon? From what statistics South Africa tells me is that South Africa has less than 5% of child labor. Ideally, we want to have 0%. So of this less than 5%, how can policy be helpful in terms of eliminating child labor, particularly in South Africa? I am joined by the head of policy in Cosatu, Ms. Lebogang Mulaisi, and she's going to give us her views about the role that policy can play. Lebogang, thank you so much for speaking to us on SABC News. You've heard me talking about the important tool that policy is. Just how important is it in this case, and what policy do we have in South Africa to make sure that child labor is eliminated at all costs?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show. So policy is a vital tool. So it gives industries, it gives government organizations, it gives all stakeholders the relevant tools, guidelines and roadmaps on how to go about eliminating child labor. In your intro, you talked about the fact that South Africa has got less than 5% when it comes to child laborers in the country. But how we've been able to achieve those strides is because we've had effective policies in order to do that. And it's a culmination of various policies that have come together and worked properly towards the elimination of child labor. So the introduction of fee-free education for children, so that they can be able to go to school for free. Introducing feeding schemes at the level of basic and secondary education has allowed for more and more children to access opportunities to education. But the strengthening of labor market policies and legislation has also led to the eradication and elimination of child labor. Having a zero tolerance towards having children in the workplace has been key to make sure that we eliminate child labor, especially in the level of the workplace.
Yeah. Now we see that informal businesses, particularly small businesses, there may be a problem there because they're not really monitored, okay? And policy, while it should be applying there, it may not necessarily be applied. How do you see the role of informal small businesses? Because that is where you would find that child labor is more prevalent and it is undetectable.
So what we do know is that child labor is more prevalent in a family setting. So what would happen is that an enterprise would then enlist the services of the children that they have. So basically children would be lending a help to the parents who are either on a farm, or children will be lending a help to their parents who are running an informal micro enterprise of some sort. So this is where the child labor is happening. So a child would be in school, but then after school school, they would then be reporting for work in the family's business. So it becomes very difficult to see, are you doing your chores as a child, or are you actively involved in child labor?
It brings me to the next question when we talk about chores. Where is the line drawn? How do we differentiate between a child being exploited and a child being taught, being taught how to do certain things in the form of chores?
I mean, then we have to look at the hours, the hours that a child would be engaged in a particular chore. I mean, there is a chore, and then there is being actively involved in an actual job, and the hours could tell us as to whether this is a chore or whether this is some sort of work.
Yeah.
The level to which that chore is starting to impede on your ability to be a functional student, I think, is another indicator where we can tell that no, we've actually crossed the line here, and this is now actively work instead of a chore, and the effort that the child would be putting in the engagement of that particular chore that then now starts to cross the line, and now we start to view this as actual work. And at most of the time, these children are not compensated for the work that they're doing because they're assisting a helping hand to the family in order to run their informal business per se.
Here's another a point that I would like us to get into. How does one differentiate? Because as parents, you'll say that, I'd like my child to be developed at a very early age and to expose them to perhaps the family business. What sort of gatekeeping measures does one now start to use to say, yes, I want you to learn about the family's paza shop business, for instance, but you cannot work for these hours or those hours. And also the issue of wanting to contribute to the finances and the development and the growth of the family business.
I mean, as a parent, the first thing that I would want is the best educational attainment for my child. So I think that should be prioritized over above everything. A child who's engaged in child labor is unable to do anything other than to be engaged in the labor. So they will put the books to the side because they won't be able to balance the two. It's a very difficult balancing act. Work and school for most adults is actually quite difficult. So putting that strain on a child, for me, I think would be difficult. So looking at the way in which, children are able to balance the two, I think there's no problem in exposing your child to an hour or two of knowing how the family business is run. But when you start to impede on the child's progress, especially in school, that's when we sound the alarm.
As a Labour Federation, obviously you are looking out for the interest of labour setting in South Africa. However, we cannot run away from the fact that when you look at our neighbouring countries, because of our porous borders as well, we find that we find a lot of migrant labourers, and you might find countries or people from neighbouring countries come in, for instance, to work in the homes as domestic workers. Have you had that encounter? Have you been speaking perhaps to federations in neighboring countries about this phenomenon, and how rife is it?
Well, what we're starting to see, especially when, people are coming into the country and they're having to work, especially in the home setting, and they have to live at their places of work. This also happens on farms as well. So issues of land tenure are also involved in that. Whereas the whole family will be engaged in the farm work or the domestic work in order to be able to generate an income. It's starting to be very prevalent, especially when we look at migrant workers. The statistics don't pick them up quite easily because when it comes to migrant labor, we're not doing very well at collecting the statistics. And besides, it becomes very difficult for somebody to come out and say that they're here as a migrant or they're here in the country illegally. But what we're starting to see as being, something that's quite prevalent, especially in your farm areas, especially in the domestic homes, is that especially if the family is living on the premises of the workplace, the whole family is involved in the participation of the work, and this would involve children as well.
So basically a country can design its own policies, but once migrant workers come in, to what extent does that policy cover them and protect them?
I think we should be doing much better than what we are. I really think we should be doing much better than what we are, and we should be doing it in the interest of protecting the child. I think regardless of what reasons bring you to South Africa, and regardless of what was the circumstance of you being here, we should be looking at policy and strengthening it, especially when it comes to the protection of children. When you are within the ages of school age, regardless of your nationality, I believe that you should be protected, and we should be giving children that protection and putting them in school rather than subjecting them to these issues because there are currently policy gaps.
Yeah. When you talk about policy gaps, what is the one glaring gap that you think, oh, this one? Should we, if we deal with this one, is the half a problem solved?
The migrant labor issue.
Right.
We really need to deal with that issue. We really need to offer protection, particularly to children, to make sure that indeed they are engaged at school. I think that's one of the issue. Care work in the families.
Yes, yes.
We often disregard care work in the family household. We don't give it any compensation. We don't think about it. But had we been addressing, the historical issue of paid care work in the household, we could be able to avert some of these issues. So because we haven't addressed, compensating care work in the household accordingly, we've allowed those gaps to emerge, and this is where children are being exploited, even in the context of their own households.
Lebogang Mulaisi, the head of policy at Cosatu, speaking to us about the role that policies plays in the broader space of eliminating child labor. Of course, this is why we are here in Durban to speak of, and experts are here gathered. Government, business organizations, labor, like Lebogang here, are here to find out what are the best tools that can be applied or used in order to eliminate child labor. Lebogang Mulaisi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And it's back to you.